I wonder. L. Lend-Lease. 91. Page 91.
Defense operations along the Volga.
Aid from our allies, England and the United States, Lend-Lease, was insignificant?
The book I have just consulted is the official history of the Soviet Air Force in World War II, written by the Ministry of Defense of the Soviet Union. Written in the early 1970s, it appears to encapsulate exactly the kind of dismissive Soviet attitude towards Lend-Lease that many in the West have come to expect. But is this, at least when focusing on aviation, a fair assessment? That's what we're going to look at today. Now, before we go into Lend-Lease, we should look at the cooperation between Soviet aviation and the West before that. The Russian Revolution and Civil War meant that the emerging Russian and later Soviet aviation industry had a very slow start. As such, foreign machines were imported to cover domestic aviation needs and allow the Soviets to learn from their designs until they could produce their own aircraft. After the First World War, the Soviet government started buying aircraft from Italy, France, the Netherlands, and sometime later from Germany. However, the largest quantity of aircraft was purchased from Great Britain, in spite of the rather strained relations between this country and Soviet Russia. Yet business is business. That it is indeed, even in the collectivist Soviet Union, yet the relationship with both Britain and America remained complicated. Not all exports to the Soviet Union were actually granted. America in particular limited sales to the Soviets, prohibiting anything of a military nature. The American Department of State shut down one export attempt with the words, "Military aircraft for Soviet Russia? In no case will this happen." Unsurprisingly, words are wind when money is involved, and some sales were made regardless. In November 1939, the war with Finland began, and on the 2nd of December 1939, the President of the United States declared a moral embargo for aircraft deliveries to the Soviet Union. American companies, one by one, started terminating contracts with Russia, and all official channels became paralyzed, yet unofficial channels survived. In March 1940, a gradual restoration of communication began. Now you might wonder, why is any of this important? After all, it's pre-war stuff. Well, this shows that the Soviet Union was no stranger to both the British and American aviation industry, had many contacts in place, and had a relatively good idea of what aircraft were out there, even though its later orders were somewhat peculiar at times. Now, pretty much immediately after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, both Great Britain and America promised their support, and I'll focus once again on the aviation part. The Soviets took full advantage. On the 30th of June, a list of cargoes that the Soviet Union needed was handed over. The Soviets wanted to receive everything at once. The list included 3,000 fighters and 3,000 bombers. To fulfill such an order, the US of A would have to completely cut off exports to other countries, including Great Britain, and curtail deliveries to its own air force. Note that at this point, these orders are not part of Lend-Lease and still considered to be normal industrial orders that had to be paid immediately. On the 1st of August, Secretary for War Stimson authorized the sale of 200 P-40 fighters. The Soviet Union immediately purchased 59 aircraft, received engines, propellers, 10,500 bombs, and 407,900 shells. Before the 30th of October, the Soviet Union spent $92 million on those purchases. In practice, the Lend-Lease Act application to the Soviet Union was initiated on the 28th of October and followed 2 days later by an interest-free loan of $1 billion granted by the US of A. Later, another credit line of $1 trillion was opened up for the USSR. In addition to that, direct purchases of different equipment and munitions for currency and gold continued. It was intended that all military material would be provided for the duration of the war. Payments were to commence 5 years after the war and would stretch over 10 years. So, how many aircraft were actually sent to the Soviet Union? Now, this is a matter of some discussion, since in some instances planes were counted double, omitted, lost, or written off. One historian notes, the USSR received 15,481 American aircraft and 3,384 British. Of the overall number of 18,865 machines, almost 17,000 were combat types. Another historian notes a slightly different number. The figure of 18,700 aircraft agrees well with Soviet and foreign sources, both as a whole and as far as the calculations of data of specific aircraft types is concerned. 700 transport aircraft and 74 trainer aircraft should be subtracted from the total imports. Note that in the annex of the translated version of the Soviet Air Force in World War II, added by the editor, it details: a State Department report on war aid furnished by the United States to the USSR lists 14,798 aircraft allocated to the Soviet Union, of which 14,018 were actually delivered. Britain sent 2,953 Hurricanes, 143 Spitfire Mark V Bs, and 1,188 Spitfire Mark IX fighters, and about 30 other aircraft, but not all arrived. Now, it should be noted that other sources indicated about 50% less Hurricanes were actually sent. Now, as you can see, there is a discrepancy and you should be aware of it. For this video, I will have to run with one number set, and I will be using the one of the most recently published source, that being 18,000 combat aircraft. But more than just aircraft were actually sent. The Soviet Union received both the aircraft and the parts, without which it would have been impossible to operate them. Furthermore, Soviet aircraft and engine factories ran to considerable extent on imported equipment, raw materials and semi-finished products. Thus, Soviet aircraft to a certain extent were also influenced by the Lend-Lease program. Now, some of you might now be wondering about aviation fuel. To answer this, check out this video by our favorite Austrian logistic expert, Military History Visualized. Now, it should be noted that while the Soviets got around their own domestic limits in high-octane fuel, many of the imported planes actually required exactly these to operate well. They required good fuel and quality oil. For example, the Rolls-Royce Merlin ran on an octane rating of 87. The powerful twin Wasp engines consumed fuel of an even higher quality with an octane rating of 97 to 100. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union mostly utilized B-70 and B-78 aviation fuel, with the figures in the designation standing for the octane number. Attempts to operate imported aircraft with Soviet fuel resulted in a loss of power and engine failures. Beginning from the middle of the war, efforts were made to operate a foreign aircraft with only good fuel, so often it was pure imported fuel. Now, over the course of the war, a vast selection of aircraft was sent, and I hope that you're ready for this because it's about to get really wild. The Soviets got Hurricanes, Spitfires, P-40s, P-39s, P-63s, P-47s, P-51s, Typhoons, A-20s, B-25s, Hampdens, Mosquitos, Catalina, Short Stirlings, O-52 Owls, Kingfishers, C-47s, C-46s, Albemarles and 86 Texans. Oh, and beyond this, they acquired a few aircraft throughout the war, more or less by chance. These are P-38s, B-17s, B-29s, B-24s, PV-1 Venturas, Lancasters and Supermarine Walruses. Now, you might now wonder, how did all of these aircraft actually get to the Soviet Union? Now, there were several routes for aircraft coming to the USSR. The northern route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk was covered by shipping, as was the route into Vladivostok in the east and the southern route to Baku and Krasnovodsk. Aircraft were shipped disassembled. Aircraft ferried by air came from the south via Iran and Iraq. Two additional air routes originated from Scotland and Sombro in the UK, although each was only used once. In the east, flying boats flew to Vladivostok, while the Alaska-Siberian route remains perhaps the most famous and the most perilous. Now, with all of these aircraft coming to the Soviet Union, this raises the question: what did Soviet pilots actually think about the aircraft they got? This is a really difficult question because it's completely subjective. I've gone through dozens of accounts of pilots speaking on the very same aircraft, and the margins between them is vast. After all, opinions are like NKV bullets. However, I generally found four consistent elements in these reflections. Soviet pilots were often critical of the early fighter variants they received from the West, citing either poor performance, handling, or their limited durability in the Russian climate. This was less so on later aircraft, which seemed to be more readily appreciated, except for the Spitfire, which seems to have been universally disliked. I actually have a video on that very topic. Another observation is that generally Soviet pilots were positive about most bombers they received, citing superior usability, comfort, utility and reliability than some domestic counterparts. Also, Soviet pilots were rather fond of the instruments and equipment present on most machines, especially bombers, finding them superior to the domestic produced equivalents. As well as that, the overall build quality was generally positively received, except for the antiquated hand-me-downs that they received sometimes. Now it's important to remember that pretty much anything the Soviets produced themselves was naturally suited to their own theater of war because it was designed with that environment in mind. Only about half of the imported aircraft had similar suitabilities. The aircraft that showed themselves to be the best advantage in the Soviet Union were exactly those which, in terms of their performance, were closest to the Soviet manufactured ones, and thus were the optimum aircraft for the Soviet-German front conditions. It is the dissimilarity in criteria that brings about a huge difference in opinion in respect to the same aircraft in Russia and in Western countries. So then, it is only natural that some planes were held in higher or lower regard than others. It also makes sense that the Soviet Union itself and its pilots tend to focus more on their own aircraft. After all, every country has a sense of pride in its own creations. But it's important to note that propaganda is indeed a thing. Concerning the tactical and technical data on combat aircraft acquired via Lend-Lease from the Americans and the British, it was recommended not to discuss this in writing or even to think about any superiority that may have existed over Soviet equipment. Considering that by mid-war the Soviet Union could largely pick and choose their aircraft of choice, they requested their favorites in increasing numbers and even had a hand in their development. Practically, that doesn't sound exactly like people that are unhappy with the equipment they're getting, but it also shows that they want to make sure that the equipment they do get is exactly suited to what they need. Now, the lasting debate on Lend-Lease is whether it was a significant factor for the Soviet Union in their struggle against Germany during World War II. Focusing on aviation once again, this is a complex issue. The book that you just got to see earlier, The Soviet Air Force in World War II, is a perfect example. It was written at the height of the cult surrounding the Great Patriotic War, and it's a book of about 400 pages in the translated version. It mentions different foreign aircraft types, but mentions Lend-Lease only twice, literally calling it insignificant. Even if we push propaganda to the side, significance remains subjective. So let's look at the numbers. Now, we've established that roughly 18,000 combat aircraft were sent to the Soviet Union. How does this contrast with domestic production? For this, let's turn to two Russian historians. According to official data, the number of combat aircraft manufactured in the USSR throughout the war totals 112,100. However, this figure is currently believed to be overstated too. The result will be approximately 18,000 from 112,100, that being some 16% of the domestic manufacture. Another historian notes, allegedly from July 1941 through August 1945, the Soviet Union produced 112,100 combat aircraft. Most likely, the point here is that the Soviet production of aircraft during the war years was overstated twofold, owing to consciously overstated bookkeeping during the war years themselves. Information about the sharp fall in work expenditure on the output of units of primary types of aircraft and tanks in the USSR in 1941 to 43 indirectly confirms this idea. With regard to the inflation of data about Soviet production, the share of Western supplies of combat aircraft constituted not 15%, as has been traditionally thought, but around 30%. However, 112,100 aircraft is the number we have, so I'll have to stick with that one for now. A detailed breakdown helps us understand these figures a little bit better. The Soviet Union manufactured more than 57,000 fighters. Thus, the share of imported fighters totals approximately 19% of this quantity. The total number of shipped bombers amounted to 4,000 against the Soviet manufacture of 17,800. The resultant share is also slightly below 90%. As for hydro aviation, the picture was more vivid. Throughout the war, almost no Soviet seaplanes were manufactured. Given this, 165 consolidated PBYs Catalinas, which were sent from the USA, turned out to be a considerable help. One interesting aspect are transport aircraft. The US sent around 900 C-47s, making up 40% of the modern Soviet transport aircraft fleet. However, the premier domestically produced Soviet transport aircraft was the Lizunov Li-2, itself a licensed copy of the American DC-3. Yet, Soviet assault aviation was supplied by domestic production only. Presented with these numbers, you can come to your own conclusions on the significance of Lend-Lease. But how come there is a debate? Well, the Cold War is one explanation, but that's not all. During and after the war, the Soviet official narrative downplayed or belittled US help. However, the private remarks of top Soviet leaders showed that Lend-Lease aid was vitally important to the defeat of Germany. Zhukov himself remembers, speaking about our readiness for war from the point of view of the economy and economics, one cannot be silent about such a factor as the subsequent help from the Allies. First of all, certainly from the American side, because in that respect the English helped us minimally. In an analysis of all facets of the war, one must not leave this out of one's reckoning. Likewise, General Lovelace remembers, "In our literature, the activity of American aircraft during combat operations at the front during the war was reduced to an absolute minimum. However, archival materials and memoirs of combat pilots paint a different picture." Considering that the figures lie right at that balancing point where, depending on what you're trying to achieve, they can be either dismissed or exaggerated, I think it is fair to say that Lend-Lease provided a noteworthy reinforcement of the Soviet Air Force without being an overwhelming factor. The majority of the Soviet Air Force was still Soviet, but it's not like foreign aircraft were exactly rare. Yet, never mind what equipment was actually used, it was used by Soviet soldiers. After all, it is the pilot that makes the plane work, and not the other way around. In light of this and the continuing debate on Lend-Lease, especially on the internet, one conclusion from a Russian author comes to mind. There is no need to either overestimate or belittle the importance of the Allies' help. They did what they could. Politicians, of course, always pursue their own ends. And who's in charge of propaganda? Yeah, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. So, what is your opinion on the impact of Lend-Lease on Soviet aviation? Tell us below. Make sure to share this video with your friends and check out my Patreon, where support from people like you make uploads like this one possible. Big thank you to Victoria Taylor for proofreading and Cosmo for sponsoring one of the books used in these videos. Make sure to check out MHV videos on Lend-Lease as well. As always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.